Our next speaker is Ulrich Pohlmann, who represents the Münchner Stadtmuseum, the Museum of the City of Munich. Ulrich Pohlmann has his doctorate in philosophy from 1989 in the history of art and in ethnology. He has worked at the City Museum Munich since 1991, so just shortly after getting that degree. And so he is a representative of a generation of continuity into the present at a time when the field of photography has changed vastly institutionally, and that in itself is quite important. He has curated many monographic and thematic exhibitions about photography and has served as an editor on several journals. Has worked on Wilhelm von Glöden, Giorgio Sommer, and other 19th century subjects, but at the museum they also present recent and contemporary artists such as Roger Ballin, for instance, and the City Museum is not only a space for exhibition and monographic treatment, but also houses several artists' estates and large archives. So please welcome Ulrich Pohlmann, who will be speaking about reading and understanding the medium using his own museum as examples over the last 50 years. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Matthew, for this kind introduction. First, I'd like to thank the organizers for the invitation. I'm really glad to be here and to talk about an institution which collects photography since the late 19th century, and to catch up with the first lecture of Jaroslav. Certainly, a museum is a place where narratives of photography are constructed. And you can see the paradigmatical changes of this development within the decades, how collection goals, also policies change, and that photography arises different interests, not only in the audience, but also in its curators. Also in Munich, there was in 1854 an international exhibition. It was the exhibition Deutsche Allgemeine Industrieausstellung, a general German industrial exhibition, which followed the first exhibitions in London, 1851, and it also took place in the Crystal Palace. And also photography was included in this exhibition. And just as a short addenda to the first lecture, I want to mention that these world exhibitions, in fact, were the first cells, the first places where also the technology of the medium was historized. So we find in universal exhibitions in, for instance, in Vienna in 1873, or later in Paris in 1900, the first historical reviews of photography as a technology. And this has to do certainly because certain developments were outdated and finally were, somehow like dinosaurs. Now, the occupation with the changing history of the Fotomuseum within the Münchner Stadtmuseum, which is now called collection photography, might bring to light a process which might represent the development of musealization of photography, at least in Germany in general. The Fotomuseum is closely linked to the building and to the conception of the Münchner Stadtmuseum. The Historical Museum of the City of Munich, how it was called at the beginning, was founded in 1888, and it should gather important artifacts as testimonies of the urban culture. After the First World War, the museum changed to the so-called type of Heimatmuseum. It's a kind of a homeland museum. It united under its roofs quite early and also nowadays 12 collections like photography, fashion, puppets, toys, musical instruments, decorative arts, posters, drawings and paintings, and also a film museum. The archive, the library, the exhibition rooms, and the offices of the Fotomuseum are located in this building, which is, well, you cannot see it, you cannot see the part of the Fotomuseum which is on the back side. It's a new building constructed in 1964, right in the heart of the city at St. Jakobsplatz, close to the Jewish Museum and the synagogue. Let us take a closer look to the history of this museum and its collection. The department photography was officially founded in 1961 as a photo and film museum. The earliest beginnings of the collection, however, originate earlier in the last quarter of the 19th century. In this period, the first donations and acquisitions entered the museum. Photographs were collected as historical documents of the urban development in Munich. The photographs had to testify the changes in architecture or to document important events of the city life, for instance, the transport of the monumental statue, the Bavaria, in the year 1850, which was documented by Alois Löcherer in the calotype process, or, for instance, the homecoming of the Bavarian troops after the Prussian-French War in 1870-71. Further portraits of well-known personalities in politics, economy, and culture were collected. All these photographs were primarily classified in the category reproduction graphics, together with etchings, woodcuts, and other printed material. They were, and they are still, located until today in the collection, graphic and painting of the City Museum. For this reason, the City Museum owns quite an extraordinary collection of rare vintage prints from the very first decades of photography, of German photography, by authors like Löcherer, Franz Hamstengel, or Joseph Albert. The first acquisitions of the newly founded Museum for Film and Photo in 1961, however, were no photographs, but optical instruments of the former glass factory of the famous optician Joseph von Fraunhofer. His estate, with more than 900 optical machines and other products, were the nucleus of the new department, which was created in cooperation with the city of Munich, the Bavarian state, and the German photo industry. Already in this first phase of the institution, different conceptions about the goals of the museum existed. The photo industry wanted to present only a survey of the technical development of photography. The city of Munich instead laid its emphasis on exhibitions and collections of photography as a cultural heritage and document. One can say that until the 1970s, the conception of the photo industry dominated the museum. More than 5,000 cameras and lenses were displayed in more than 40 glass cases, together with 250 photographic reproductions, not one original vintage print among these. The history of photography was presented as a mixture of the genius of inventors, but without any relation to the image and its meanings. However, in this period, in the 1960s, there were a few extraordinary photographic exhibitions in the Münchner Stadtmuseum. For instance, there was a retrospective of the French photographer Charles Nègre from the collection of André Jam, or the photography collection of Helmut and Alison Gernsheim on the history of photography was presented in 1960. Further, in 1970, the exhibition Painting After Photography from the Camera Obscura until Pop Art explored the relationships between photography and painting on a broader scale. Finally, in 1975, the exhibition The Photo Album, 1858 to 1918, presented for the first time, at least in German museums, the use of private photography as a cultural phenomenon. In 1976, the Photo and the Film Museum were separated in two independent departments. At the same time, the conception of the Fotomuseum also changed fundamentally from a primarily technically orientated collection to a photography collection. In 1979, the private collection of the German Jewish immigrant photographer Josef Breitenbach was bought by the city, and this collection signified a clear cut from the past. It contained more than 20,000 vintage prints by Talbot, Helen Adamson, Caneva, Felice Beato, Fenton, Raylander, Macpherson, Samuel Bourne, Julia Margaret Cameron, Baldus, Adolf Braun, Adjei, Stieglitz, Coburn, Abbott, Erich Salomon, Alfred Eisenstedt, André Kertész, Roman Wisniak, Edward Weston, Hans Nermuth, but also 250 daguerreotypes, 2,500 carte visite, 600 stereoscopic images, many photo albums, and examples of all photographic print techniques in the 19th century. Breitenbach has built up his collection during the exile in Paris and in New York in the 1930s and 1940s. Often, he exchanged his own photographs with works by befriended photographers like Robert Capa or Barbara Morgan, André Kertész, Lisette Model, or Erwin Blumenfeld, just to mention a few. Breitenbach's passion for collecting photography was closely linked to his teaching job at the New School for Social Research in New York. He used the photographs as a didactical instrument for his lessons. This acquisition of the collection Breitenbach, one can say, was really a great fortune for the further development of the department photography, because it opened up the horizons from a more local to an international perspective. Within the following years, the collection grew rapidly. For instance, in 1984, the photography collection and library of Uwe Scheid, who was president of the association Club der Guerre, was acquired. And this contained, for instance, the illustrated book by Talbot, The Pencil of Nature, or interesting publications of the 1920s and 30s by Man Ray, Germaine Krull, and many others. Uwe Scheid also collected hundreds of illustrations in cartoons and photography which relate to the professional activities of photographers in the 19th century. These are an excellent source for understanding the social and also the political impact of photography in the Western Hemisphere. Finally, he donated at about 1,000 books only on the subject of nude photography. Well, it's impossible to mention all these estates, but in the last 25 years, more than 30 photographic estates entered the collections. Some, like the estate of Franz Hamstengel or Thomas Höpker, the former president of Magnum, were donations. Most recently, there was a donation, for instance, of the estate of Hermann Lanzhoff, a German-American photographer who was mainly working in New York. Other archives, like the ones of Herbert List, or the fashion photographer Regina Rehlang, the photojournalist Philip Kester, or the American-German pictorialist Frank Eugene Smith, or the photojournalist Stefan Moses, These all were acquisitions with the help of foundations and also city funding. Yeah, and this process is going on. In the moment we try to acquire the collection of Dietmar Siegert on German photography in the 19th century, which is also a collection of 8,000 images from 1840 to 1890. Yeah, further, and then I just want to mention, just to give you an impression of the variety of, and of the spectrum of the collection, the photo archives of the former Deutscher Kunstverlag, with more than 20,000 vintage prints in relation to architecture from 1880 to 1940, as well as a photo archive of the illustrated weekly, Quick, which was beside Der Stern, one of the major illustrated newspapers after 1945 in Germany, with more than 350,000 press prints were given as donations to the museum. Today, the collection has gathered around 850,000 photographs, 1.5 million negatives and slides, but also 30,000 technical apparatus like cameras, lenses, etc., as well as a library with at about 12,000 titles, and among those 1,000 rare books, mostly photographically illustrated ones. So you can imagine this already. These quantities give quite a lot of problems regarding the inventory, but also the yes, the presentation. There are different deposit rooms within where the collection is stored within the building, and further there exists a recently constructed deposit building in the northern part of Munich with about 10,000 square meters for all the collections in the Stadtmuseum. And there is a special cooling chamber for the negative as well as for the color material for the photography collection. Well, usually these estates are presented in exhibitions and also published in catalogs. And these catalogs are naturally the result of scientific researches which last several years. There's also, let me see, I don't know how to move it on, just, oh, thank you. There's also a platform, a small platform for contemporary positions since 2005. Mainly concentrating on contemporary German photography. Show you some installation shots. Yes, and as Matthew Witkowski already mentioned, we present contemporary artists as well, like Roger Bell or Bernd and Hilla Becher. These were shows which happened in the last years. I want to come to a kind of a conclusion. I think that the Stadtmuseum, with its compound of various special collections, offer quite good conditions for interdisciplinary working. The architect and writer, Gottfried Semper, has defined as one purpose of a so-called ideal museum 160 years ago, after visiting the Universal Exhibition in London in 1851, as follows: public collections are the true teachers of the people. The medium photography in the museum offers for this purpose, I think, excellent suppositions, because of its specific relation to what we call in general the relation to reality. Photography collections represent something like a collective memory of time and of society. As a product of civic age and of industrial revolution, photography represents a hybrid nature which mirrors, since its invention, the never-ending discourse between the natural sciences, the technical improvements, and the arts. Photography has created a new iconography of modern life and society, which has no equivalent in the traditional fine arts. Photographs conceal a broad cultural history within themselves, which relate to different social, economic, political, literal, and artistic aspects. For this reason, it is also necessary to approach photography on a highly diversified scientific basis, which can only be interdisciplinary. We need today a fertile dialogue between different methods, relying not only on purely art historical expertise and interpretation. Photography stood for a long time under the pressure to be legitimized as a known discipline within the system of arts. Nowadays, this problem seems to be solved, at least superficially, and we can, instead of legitimizing photography as fine arts over and over again, to perceive the many different meanings of photography in our culture. Our colleague Urs Stahl, who was a former director of the Fotomuseum in Winterthur in Switzerland, asked a few years ago very simply, what is it photography? And I believe that photography museums can be the central platforms in the institutions to give answers to this question, also in giving the support for our orientation within a universe of images which becomes more and more complex, especially in the age of digital imagery. Now, instead of showing 5 minutes, then I'm done. Is this okay? Or 3? Okay. Instead of showing you now really the famous pearl of chains, chain of pearls of very famous incunabula of the history of photography, I want to attract a little bit your attention to private photography, which has been strongly neglected not only as a collector's item, but also an exhibition. And we made, for instance, in 2010, an exhibition which was called Strangers in Focus on photography albums from the Second World War, which was mainly really dominated by the question that we see that we have less and less testimonies, living testimonies of the Second World War. A new generation, the second and the third post-war generation, mostly relate to the oral history as well as the photographic albums which were given from their grandparents, parents, or uncles and stayed in the family. So we took a closer look at about 150 different albums which came mainly from private collections as well as from our own, and tried to understand better the narrative of these special albums, which have, each album is different, each follows an own narrative, but you can see that the private motivation for photographing and documenting the war was quite different than the official press photography reportage, which you can see in the official public media. So the impact of this exhibition in the public was enormous, and it was widely discussed, and people started to discover their own family archives and their own family albums, and we established twice a week kind of a consulting hour where, and it didn't stay with 1 hour, but there were 3 hours, 4 hours, where people brought their photographic albums, and they, for the first time, also got some help for the interpretation, for the reading of these albums, and some of them certainly experienced very unpleasant, knowledge about that about the involvement of their parents, of their grandparents during the war. Some discovered, for instance, that they were participating in war crimes, and which was a very was a very difficult task also to deal with. So this exhibition helped us also to work and to deal with a more or less suppressed part of German history and to bring it into the present, well, across photography. Thank you very much.